Welcome to the Jaren Jarvis channel. I am Jaren Jarvis. Today, I would like to introduce to you, an old friend of mine got back into contact with me recently. I really wish he hadn't. Part 4. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. Alright, everyone. With the last post, I'll finish telling you about what happened to John and I down in the Tree of Life. I'm still not exactly sure why I'm recounting this story. Is it supposed a cautionary tale, to keep anybody else that might be curious away from that monstrous place? Am I trying to honor John's memory in some way? Or has this entire thing just been some kind of therapy work for me? I honestly don't know. Maybe it's all of those things. Maybe it's none of them. Either way, I have to tell this story. I have to. According to my phone, it had been an hour since the tree had sealed off our exit. I didn't even know if that was accurate anymore, mind you. My sense of time had been shot to pieces by everything that had been happening down in the roots, not to mention the strange effect that the place seemed to have been having on my thoughts. I could literally watch the seconds tick by on the clock, and a minute would still feel like an hour. Was it the walls that were doing it? The light they emanated had been getting brighter, to the point that John and I had just shut off our flashlights. Since we could see just by the bioluminescence, it meant that we could save the batteries for later, too. Maybe it was the fruits, instead. I had given in to eating them, just as John had. I had genuinely tried to keep myself from doing so, but the hunger eventually grew too strong, and without any normal food to eat, I couldn't suppress it any longer. The odd thing was that they weren't having any of the effects that were listed in the Voynich manuscript on either John or I anymore. When we first sampled the rhubarb, it had caused urination, just like the manuscript had said, but now the cauliflower that was supposed to induce sweating was doing nothing. Nor was the eggplant that was supposed to cause a greenish tint to my vision. I tried a rhubarb again, just to see, and nothing there, either. I wondered if the people who wrote the manuscript, or even the people who created all of the buildings and shrines that conceal or mark entrances to the roots around the world, had ever been that far into the tree, or if they had ever been down there for as long as John and I had been. Maybe it was something about how deep we were, or how much time we had spent in here, that made us less sensitive to the fruits. Maybe it was just that we were just becoming more attuned to the tree. Maybe the walls only seemed brighter because the tree was slowly transforming our bodies, adapting us to it, and within a few hours, we'd be just like those amoeba things that were still crawling around us. Those were the thoughts that I struggled with as I continued to trudge down through those steely grey corridors. Paranoia, anxiety, and fear gnawed on every cell of my brain, and it felt like some sort of panic attack or nervous breakdown was constantly on the horizon. I conjured up some willpower that I never knew I had, though, and kept my feet moving, one in front of the other. I was going to get out of those roots, and I couldn't let terror slow me down. I had managed to convince John to not try and fight any more things that we encountered down there. You don't want to die before you see what's at the end, do you? Was enough to get him to reconsider his aggressive attitude, which had peaked when he ended up smashing an amoeba thing apart with his sledgehammer. We came upon a few more animals that neither him nor I could recognize, in spite of my extensive nature show experience, and we hid inside tunnels while we waited for the more predatory-looking ones to move on. Every time we came upon a strange animal down there that seemed docile, though, the parts of my brain that remained in research mode wanted to take a break from our march down those tunnels, to observe them, to take notes, to document them. I knew that wasn't an option, though, as appealing as it was to my amateur zoologist sentiments. Every minute I would waste trying to play scientist on some alien-looking creature was a minute that I wasn't walking further along, trying to find some way or something that would lead me out of that hellacious place. I doubt John would have been too enthused about waiting on me, either, so that was just more motivation to keep going. Eventually, though, we came upon an entity that neither of us could simply ignore and walk past. As we continued to walk along the route with addled minds and foggy brains, I noticed a hand sticking out of the wall. More accurately, a hand had just grown out of the tree bark in front of us. My companion and I both froze in our tracks, and John hefted his sledgehammer nervously. I myself held my flashlight in a weapon-like grip, for whatever good it might have done me. The body part in question started to grow further out of the wall, or, rather, an arm that was attached to the hand began to grow out. Whatever it was that was coming out of the wood seemed to have human enough like flesh, but I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing at that moment. The pale skin stopped once the thing being birthed from the tree had its shoulder out of the wall, though, instead, there was something akin to bark the color of the root it was coming out of. As its torso began to slide out of the wood, I recognized with some small degree of humor that it appeared to be a t-shirt of some sort, or at least a bark-made simulacrum of one. Once the thing's face appeared, though, all degree of fascination left my mind, replaced instead with sheer horror. After a short while longer, the creature had made its way entirely out of the tree, and stood in front of John and I, human-looking flesh, mock wooden clothes, and my face. The three of us stood there for what must have been a good 2 or 3 minutes, just staring at each other. John and I glanced over at each other, but neither of us seemed willing to do or say anything. Amoeba things were one situation, mongolonyxes were another, but that trumped them all, by far. That clone of me just sort of stood there, eyes glued on me. To say that it was the single most terrifying situation that I had encountered down in the tree up until that point, not to mention my entire life, would be understating the sort of fear I felt. I've heard tales of people meeting doppelgangers and being unsettled by it, but that usually involves their mirror just being another regular, human person that sort of looks like them. That was something else entirely. I had no idea what was going on, or how to even handle it. The tree had made some sort of copy of me. But why? Eventually, I spoke up. Still keeping my eyes locked on my clone, I spoke in a whisper over to John. I idly thought that I had been having to whisper a lot tonight, as I did so. John, what the fuck is that? Before John could respond, though, the simulacrum opened its mouth, and in a voice that sounded nothing like any human voice I had ever heard, repeated my words. John, what the fuck is that? It's impossible to describe the noise that thing made. It sounded like my own voice, but only in the absolute loosest sense. It was like someone had recorded my words, then sent them through 1,000 different voice filters and modulators, before putting them out through the lowest quality speakers they could find with the treble turned all the way up. We were frozen for another minute or so, as John and I both desperately tried to process what was in front of us, and what it had just did. John finally managed to form some words up, and responded, I have no fucking clue. As soon as the words were out of John's mouth, the creature turned its attention towards my companion. In a short second, the flesh and the wood that the fake me was made out of morphed around rapidly, its skin and bark clothes looking to bubble and boil before it settled, now into John's face and the outfit he wore. I have no fucking clue. It spoke, again, with that same sort of tone, the oral equivalent of the uncanny valley. As horrifying as it was, at least it wasn't hostile. That was one thing to be thankful for, I supposed. John gulped, audibly, and the doppelganger replicated the action and the noise. Even here, the gulp sound wasn't quite right, in some indescribable way. As confused as we were, the two of us understood some the basics of what was going on, about how it seemed to lock onto whoever had last spoken, how it shape-shifted to look like them, and how it repeated their actions. We didn't have to speak to one another to confirm our mutual, and neither my companion nor I even seemed to dare to do so. John lifted his hand up in front of him in slow, agonizing movements. The creature seemed to be about a half second behind in copying him, but even so delayed it replicated him like a mirror. John, as always, was either braver or more foolhardy than I was, and he stepped towards the clone John, with his opposite perfectly mocking his movements as he did so. After a few steps from both, even the simulacrum's feet hitting the floor echoed off the walls wrong. As impossible as such a thing seemed, John pressed his hand up against his copies. I held my breath, waiting for the tree around us to start shaking, or for the roots to start moving again, or for the entity to absorb John or blow up or something similarly dramatic, but nothing of the sort happened. Instead, John simply turned his head towards me, the clone, rather than turning his head, looked to where the original John was looking, and nodded. So, the thing really was human, or at least close enough to it, made out of real flesh and presumably real bone underneath. I let out a simple "huh" in response to the revelation, but that was apparently enough for the doppelganger to divert its attention to me again. Another morphing of flesh and wood, and it looked like me once more. Huh. Even now, I still don't know what it was that caused me to act how I did. Maybe it was some instinctual anger towards something stealing my face and trying to imitate my voice. Maybe it was the tree, still causing me to feel those strange, weird, exaggerated emotions. Maybe that thing was just the proverbial straw on my proverbial back after everything I had been through down there. Maybe there were too many damn fucking maybes down in that place. I began to march towards the simulacrum. I knew that it had a half-second delay to its actions, and that would be more than enough time. I drew back my hand into a raised fist, and slammed it hard into the doppelganger, at the same time that it had copied my initial action. It was surprisingly flimsy, especially for a product of the root, and fell over without too much of a fuss. That wasn't enough to abate the odd rage that boiled in my heart at that moment, though. I reached over to where John was, the thing on the ground mirroring my movements even as it struggled to stand back up, and grabbed my companion's sledgehammer from him. The entity lifted its own hands up in mimicry of me holding the hammer above my head, but it wasn't holding the same brutal weapon that I was. A solid hit to the clone's head sent it back down onto the ground, after it had managed to make its way to a half-standing position. I descended on the thing, collapsing the sledgehammer down so that I could more easily use it up close and personal. I began bashing its head in with my tool. Red, warm, human blood, amongst bone and brain and muscle and all other viscera, splattered onto me, John, and our surroundings. Even after its skull was nothing but pulp on the ground, I continued slamming into it. That unknown fury drove me forward, even when there was nothing left to destroy, nothing left to take that indescribable rage out on. The only reason I stopped was because John grabbed my arm mid-swing. Ironically enough, it seemed that I was the one using the tool of his more than he was, perhaps even more violently than he ever had down there, too. Yet another emotional outburst stopped by my friend. Not much else to do at that point. I just wiped the gore off of my face, and looked down at the job I had done to the clone. I wanted to vomit, I wanted to cry again, I wanted to scream once more, but there was nothing left in me to do any of that, not at that point. The place was just fucking with us now. That was the only answer. It was toying with us. It delighted in seeing us go mad, descend into a sort of animalistic behavior, like the Mongolonics from before, tearing and rending into things like a beast. Who knew that a stupid fucking tree could be that malicious? Neither John nor I said anything else after that. I stood up, the doppelganger's now headless body lying still below me. I watched for it to possibly regenerate, not putting something like that past a creature of the roots, but it thankfully did no such thing. But I didn't even bother to pick my pack back up. I had the hammer, I had my flashlight. The map, the compass, the GPS, all of that bullshit was pointless by that point. None of it would help us get out of here, not now, not when we were just playthings for that stupid place to have fun with, to torment as it saw fit. Without any further ceremony, I just started walking further down those increasingly luminescent corridors. My partner and I had been slogging along up until that point, but now I was in a veritable half-jog. I would continue going for miles, hundreds of miles if I had to, but I needed to see something at the end of that stupid fucking tunnel, whether it was an exit or some sort of tree brain to bash in with my hammer out of frustration, out of revenge at that point. I had been done with that place ever since it had cut off our escape route before. But now I was well and truly fucking done with that place. John followed behind, matching my pace, and perhaps a bit wary of me after what he saw me do to the simulacrum. The rest of the route, for its part, was silent except for our footfalls and the distant shaking as the tree moved its tunnels around. I didn't know what time it was anymore. I had lost my phone somewhere along the line, and I wasn't about to backtrack to find it. I silently cursed myself for not bringing a watch along, too, but I didn't have the time or energy to worry about stuff like that, not by then. Was it 4 a.m.? Was it noon? Was it the next evening? Hell, maybe it had been a few days and I was fired from my job for not showing up or calling out of my shift. I couldn't tell, not down in those strange, alien, fucked up underground tunnels. For all I knew, I would spend the next 10 years walking down those corridors, looking for whatever might be at the end. Maybe I'd walk my whole life and never find it. Maybe the roots would sustain me, and I'd walk until the sun turned into a red giant and consumes the planet. I'd keep walking, either way, until I found some escape, or some answer as to the reason for John and I's suffering. Eventually, though, the tree seemed to have had enough of toying around with us. The two of us had been simply marching along, when another tree quake suddenly occurred close to us, very close to us, and strong enough to knock us off our feet. Some part of me knew what was about to, and sure enough, the small portion of the route that we were in began to move independent of the surrounding corridor. The little ride it sent us on lasted maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Even with my skewed sense of time, I at least had a grasp on that, and when it ended, we were placed so that our little route bubble had attached itself to yet another small room, one with a brightly shining pool of what looked like water in it, the pool being about 30 feet in diameter or so. It was the first body of any liquid of any kind that we had encountered down in the roots, and that fact alone made it ominous and obviously dangerous. Were we at the end? Was that thing what the tree had brought us so deep in to see? That's what it seemed like at that moment, at least. John and I carefully crawled towards the pool on our hands and knees, holding onto our flashlights and the sledgehammer as if they were the most important things in the world. At that point, they may as well have been, at least to us. As we approached the liquid, it was immediately obvious that it was almost completely opaque, or at least emitting enough of the same bluish light that the walls were giving off, albeit in much greater luminosity than the wood around us, that we couldn't see very far down. I was the first one to test things out. That time, I took the sledgehammer, still collapsed down, and poked at the surface of the pool with the end of the handle. I had expected the liquid to respond in the same way that the fluid-like bodies of the amoeba things had, that is, not react at all, but I was sorely mistaken in that assumption. The moment that the hammer touched the liquid, whatever the substance was wrapped itself around the point of contact and then continued to crawl up the handle, encompassing more and more of the tool. I quickly dropped the sledgehammer, not wanting the fluid to continue past it and onto my hand, and watched as the pool sucked in and absorbed the object I had just been holding onto. Shit. That was all that either of us could say. We both knew that the hammer likely wouldn't have been of any use past that point, but it was still unnerving to see our only meaningful weapon, the flashlights, did not count, in spite of my best attempts to convince myself otherwise, be dragged under the surface of some unknown pool of some unknown liquid. The two of us sat up from our crawling positions, sitting across from each other on opposite walls of the route. We alternated between looking at one another, looking at the pool, and sometimes fiddling with our flashlights. I'm not quite sure how long we did that, but it was obvious why we were delaying the inevitable. Just like back after the encounter with the Mongolonyx, we both knew that the tree wasn't going to be merciful on us and move the route back to where we had been. It had done what it had done because it was expecting something of us, because it wanted something from us. I didn't want to give in to it, of course, not after what I had seen it do to the sledgehammer, and not after everything else I had seen down there. John, for as maverick as he had been during the whole expedition up until now, didn't seem too up for it, either. And so we sat there for an hour, maybe 2, maybe 3, seeing how long we could put off doing what we knew we would eventually have to do. We nibbled on some fruits that were growing nearby, but by that point we had lost even our formerly insatiable appetites for those. John was the first to stand up. He brushed himself off as he gazed down at me, his eyes filled with resignation, and with defeat. The roots had beaten him. I couldn't blame him, of course, not after all we had been through down there. Doppelgangers. Supposedly extinct predators. That hunger for the fruits. The effects on our psyche. That alien glow of the walls. Our escape routes being cut off, twice now. But, some part of me, some foolish part of me, didn't want him to go. John. No. I shook my head, weakly, as I continued to sit there, looking up at my companion, at one of my oldest friends, as he simply gazed over to the still, calm pool next to us. You know I have to. Of course I knew he had to. I knew that one of us, likely both of us, were going to have to. But I didn't want to admit it, and so I used the bullshit excuses that I knew were bullshit, to try to convince him to stay. No, you don't, John. We can wait here. Wait for the roots to move again. John calmly, very calmly, simply shook his head in response. No. You know they won't do that. This thing. This place, it can keep us alive for as long as it wants. We don't need food, or water, or sleep, or anything. It'll keep us down here for weeks, for months, until we break and does what it wants. John just smiled that stupid fucking smile of his at me, with a sad, melancholy, distant look on his face even as he did. May as well get it over with before I go crazy, yeah? My friend began walking over towards the surface of the liquid. I could see the light emanating out of it illuminate his face. He was scared. He was terrified. He was horrified. Of course he was. Who wouldn't be? Taste testing the fruit had been one thing. Fighting off the Mongolonics had been another. Even encountering the doppelganger hadn't been the worst thing possible. But that? There was no coming back from that. Both of us knew it, on some instinctual level. John, no. I still tried to protest, even though I knew it was pointless, knew that he wasn't going to listen, either way. John. No. I yelled, louder, my voice harsh, raspy. John placed one foot in the pool. I shouted again, louder. John. No. The fluid came up and wrapped around his lower leg, and began to crawl up his pants. Rather than waiting, though, John placed his next foot in. I could see his face contorting in something that resembled pain as he did. He began to walk further and further into the liquid, until he was at about waist height. It was around that point that I could tell that something was crawling inside of him. I don't know what it was. It wasn't like insects, like you might see in some gross-out film about worms inside of your skin, but there was something inside of John's body. Something indescribable. Something that was, to some deeply buried part of my brain, beautiful. I didn't have the time to be horrified by that thought, though. I called out one last time, in desperation. John. Where are you going? Halfway into the liquid, John turned around, slowly, as if moving through tar. His eyes were all black, now, black as ink, his countenance in some inhuman expression that I didn't know a face could make, and he spoke with a voice that sounded like it was a mile away. I'm going home. The rest of his body sunk beneath the surface of the pool, and the liquid was still a moment later. That was the last I saw of him. I fell back against the wall of the root, and began sobbing uncontrollably once again. John wasn't there to stop me or console me that time. I was alone in the tree, now, completely and utterly isolated, who knows how deep underground. I kept looking over to the pool, as if I was expecting John to come back out of it, to tell me it was all a joke, that it was just a prank, that I'd been punked, that we'd be going back now, and everything would go back to how it was before we ever stepped foot into that stupid fucking cave in Mesa Verde. I knew that wasn't going to happen, though, but my mind, flooded with despair, with anguish, kept looking for any delusional hope that I could hang on to. Maybe I would go crazy, just like John had said. Maybe I was already going crazy. I continued to cry, to scream, to yell, to slam my fist against the bark next to me. I threw fruits, tore into them with my teeth, threw some into the pool, only to see them vanish a second later. I kicked, I yelled, I slammed my flashlight against the wall and watched its parts go flying around the room. Eventually, I collapsed once more, unable to continue my tantrum. I sort of just curled up into a fetal position at that point, in the middle of the corridor, and even began to suck my thumb. I must have looked so pathetic at that moment. How long could I hold out before I followed John into the pool? I could already feel myself slipping, could already feel myself giving up. I knew it was only a matter of a very limited amount of time. And then, a tree quake began. I knew what the shaking meant, by that point. I couldn't believe that it was happening. And I wasn't about to let it happen, either. I scrambled up, and dashed over towards the pool. I wasn't thinking straight, I had gone screwball, but I wasn't going to let that place take me away from John. Of course I didn't want to go down into that liquid. Of course I didn't. But John had gone in. And that meant that I had to go in, too. I didn't make it in time, though. The route closed my path off to the pool with a wall of wood before I was even halfway there. That didn't stop me, though, as my outburst flared up once again, my fists slamming against the bark that had just risen to cut me off from my friend. Even if strange things would crawl through my body, even if my eyes would go black, I didn't want to just leave John down in that strange, fucked up tree, all alone by himself. It seemed that the tree itself wasn't about to give me that option, though. The quake lasted long after I had eventually managed to settle down once more, and it must have been a full hour or so before it finally came to a close. Once the roots around me had stopped moving, I looked around to see that a new corridor had been placed in front of me. I had no idea which direction it was heading at that point. Maybe the place would lead me to be eaten by a Mongolonyx, or something else. Maybe it would just lead me to another pool, one that it had intended for me to use, instead of the other one. I had no way of knowing what my fate would be if I started walking down that tunnel, but I knew that walking down it was the only thing for me to do at that moment. And so I began to walk. I quickly realized that the walls where I was were not nearly as luminescent as they had been. Did that mean I was closer to the surface? Did that mean it was leading me out? I didn't dare hope that, not after everything the tree had done to John and I. Besides, with my flashlight broken, I had no way of seeing in the dark, and it was becoming dimmer and dimmer as my feet continued forward. Eventually, I was unable to see at all, and I moved simply by feeling the wall next to me with my hand. At some point, the wall was no longer made of wood. It was made of stone. I knew what it meant, but I didn't have the capacity left in me to celebrate. It was leading me to an exit. For what reason, I don't know. Maybe it got more enjoyment out of seeing me survive the situation it had put me in, traumatized and haunted by the image of my friend being dragged under the surface of the pool. I wanted to be thankful that I was getting out of there, but I couldn't, not when I knew that I wasn't escaping, but simply being let out, like some animal from a cage. After a while, I saw literal light at the end of the tunnel. My legs began to feel weak, my eyes heavy, my throat parched, as the sustaining effects of the tree had long left me, but I continued forward. As I left the cavern, I realized a few things. Firstly, it had put me back at the Mesa Verde tunnel we had entered through. Secondly, it had returned my phone to me. Thirdly, it had also returned my keys to me. How nice of it. According to my phone, it was about 1 p.m., and the position of the sun in the sky seemed to confirm that. I checked the date, and it was only the day after we had first stepped foot into the tunnels. We had been down there for less than 18 hours. It truly, really had felt like days, but it was only less than 18 hours. I stumbled back to my car, scaring a number of tourists along the way with what I could only assume was a disheveled and psychotic-seeming appearance. There were some spare provisions in the back that John and I had taken along, and I devoured them like a hungry beast, sating the hunger and thirst that had been suppressed by the route while I had been down there. Once I had had my fill of delicious, wonderful normal food, I simply sat in the driver's seat for an hour or so. I turned on the radio, turned on the air conditioner, and blindly flipped through the notifications on my phone. I wasn't processing any of it, of course, but doing those things, those normal, mundane things, felt like some sort of ritual that would help return me to sanity and stability, at least, return me to normalcy long enough for the drive back home. Just leaving the park itself was hard enough, though. I knew that leaving that lot and heading down the road would be to really, truly say that I knew that John was gone, that there was no getting him back from the tree of life. It was admitting that the pool had taken him, and would not return him. I had to admit that he was gone, though. What was there to do after something like that, anyways? Tell the cops that a malicious tree had kidnapped my friend? Organize another expedition down into this abominable tunnels? Were there Tree of Life trauma support groups in my community that I could go to? I knew that there was nothing to be done. Who would even believe me, aside from some fringe folks on the internet? There was nothing that I could do. There was just and simply nothing that I could do. I put my car into gear, and began driving back home. I slept for the rest of the day once I had got back, and the following night, and the next day, and the next night. I ate and drank whenever I woke up, but I couldn't do much more. It felt like those roots had sucked the energy, the life force out of me while I was down there, even as it pretended to sustain me, and my body knew that it had to recuperate and recover from my experience. I could barely get myself to work for my next shift, and I had to bullshit some nonsense about having a cold to explain why I looked like I had just been through hell and back. Of course, for all I knew, I probably had been. But, as I said, there was nothing that I could do about the experience John and I had down in the Tree of Life. Obviously, I'm telling you the story now, but what good is even that going to do? It won't bring John back. It won't do anything about that monstrosity living beneath our very feet. Is the tree even living? I don't honestly know, to be honest. Even after everything I had been through, I still don't think that I even know 1% of what that place is all about. All of that aside, though, I knew that I had to move on. I could say something cheesy like it's what John would have wanted. But that's not even the point. I had to move on. There was just nothing else to do. It's been a few months since then. I've managed to mostly return myself to working order. I go out with my friends, and I do my best to act normal. I don't feel normal anymore, of course, not after what the tree had done to me, which I still feel in my body even now. Not after the things I saw and experienced that I down there that I can't tell anyone I know, or ever will know. The expedition into the tree was less than a day, but it could be years, and I don't know if I could ever return to a true sense of normal. Of course, the dreams aren't helping much, either. It's the same dream, every night, down to even the smallest of details. I'm sitting on a small island of that steely grey wood. The sky above me is pitch black, without any trace of the sun, the moon, or any stars. Surrounding me is an ocean of that liquid, glowing almost blindingly bright, and in front of me, only his head above water, with ink-dark eyes and unknown things moving around underneath his skin, is John. For a while, we talk about normal things. Remembering high school, talking about current jobs, relationships, friends, family. Chatting excitedly about dumb occult stuff like cryptids, or UFOs, or MK Ultra. After a while, though, the dream always ends the same way. John suddenly gets very serious, and his black eyes focus onto mine. His mouth opens, and he says you should come home soon, too. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart beating a mile a minute, and the anxiety keeps me up for the rest of the night. I know what the tremor's all about, of course. They're the last gift that the tree has given me. A nightly reminder of what I went through down there. A nightly reminder that John is gone, and never coming back. A nightly reminder that I left John down there, by himself, beneath the surface of the pool, to suffer through whatever those roots are still doing to him alone. I really hope the dreams stop, soon.